The Bennett's holiday gala was everything you'd expect from Boston's high society. Grand, ostentatious, and more about appearances than genuine celebration. I stood near the edge of the crowd, sipping a bourbon I didn't even want, and watched the charade play out. The chandelier in the entrance hall glowed like a golden sun, bathing the room in light. Everything about the scene screamed perfection. Polished laughter, clinking champagne glasses, and Natalie, my wife, floating through the crowd in an emerald dress that made her look every bit the part of a queen. The Bennetts, Edward and Margaret, were the ultimate hosts, making everyone feel like they belonged, even if they didn't. I knew better. I'd fought tooth and nail to earn my place among Boston's elite, climbing my way up from nothing. Marrying Natalie Morgan Parker, their perfect daughter, had cemented my standing. But tonight, there was something off. A tension beneath the surface I couldn't quite place. I'd grown used to the Bennett's penchant for spectacle, but as I watched Natalie laugh just a little too easily at something Philip Grant, her ex-fiancé, had said, unease twisted in my gut. "Daniel," a familiar voice said, low enough to cut through the hum of conversation. I turned to see Dr. Anthony Collins standing in the doorway of the study. His face, usually calm and reassuring, looked uncharacteristically tense. "Can we speak privately?" he asked. I nodded, setting my glass down and following him into the study. As soon as the door clicked shut, I knew whatever he had to say wasn't good. "What's this about, Anthony?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. He hesitated, clasping his hands together like he was about to deliver bad news to a patient, which I suppose he was. "It's about the infertility treatments you've been undergoing," he said carefully. The air seemed to leave the room. "What about them?" Anthony took a deep breath. "You never needed them, Daniel. Your test results have always been normal." I stared at him, the words not quite registering. "What are you saying?" "Natalie told me. She asked me to keep it from you," he interrupted, his voice steady but full of regret. "She said it was for your peace of mind." I didn't agree with the decision, but I honored her request. Until now. For a moment I couldn't speak. My thoughts were a jumble of disbelief, anger, and betrayal. The treatments, the appointments, the guilt I'd carried for years. It had all been based on a lie. Why would she do this? I finally managed, my voice low and raw. Anthony shook his head. "That's something only Natalie can answer. But you deserved to know the truth." I didn't have time to process his words before the sound of raised voices outside the study drew my attention. Edward Bennett's sharp tone cut through the hum of the party. "You've let this go too far," he hissed. "You know we didn't have a choice." Margaret snapped back, her voice just as fierce. I moved closer to the door, straining to hear. "Do you realize what Philip and Natalie have done?" Edward continued, his words dripping with anger. "That so-called adoption initiative is a corrupt scheme. They're exploiting desperate families, and they're using Daniel's name to give it credibility." I froze. My name, my reputation. Margaret's response was quieter, harder to make out, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The truth, or at least a piece of it, was out. Natalie and Philip were running some kind of fraudulent operation, and they were using me as their cover. My hands clenched into fists as the weight of it all sank in. Natalie had lied to me about the infertility treatments, undermining my faith in our marriage. And now I was learning that she, and her ex-fiancé of all people, had been using me to legitimize something far worse. The voices outside grew quieter, but the storm inside me raged. I thought about the years I'd spent building my life, proving myself worthy of the world Natalie and the Bennetts inhabited. I'd sacrificed more than I cared to admit, but I'd done it willingly because I thought I was building something real. Now I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I stepped back from the door, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The gala continued beyond the walls of the study, the laughter and music a cruel reminder of the facade everyone else saw. But for me, the cracks in that facade had widened into gaping holes. They thought they could use me. They thought I'd stay blind. They were wrong. As I left the study, I felt a new resolve take hold. The Bennetts could keep up their charade, but I was going to get to the truth about the adoption scheme, about Natalie, about everything. Whatever it took, I would uncover their secrets. And when I did, I would make sure they paid for every lie. The days that followed the Bennett's holiday gala were a blur of anger, disbelief, and determination. I couldn't stop replaying Dr. Colin's words in my head or the argument I'd overheard between Edward and Margaret. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I didn't know about the life I'd built with Natalie, or the lies it was built on. The first step was confronting Collins again. I tracked him down at his private clinic, catching him just as he was about to leave for the day. He looked uneasy when he saw me, his hand lingering on the doorframe as if he were considering an escape. "We need to talk," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. He gestured for me to come in, and we sat in his office. "You owe me the truth," I said bluntly. "No more half answers. Why did Natalie make you falsify my records? What was she trying to hide?" Collins sighed, rubbing his temples. "Natalie didn't want children with you, Daniel," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "She told me she couldn't face the fallout of saying that outright, not with her parents' expectations and the image they wanted her to maintain. So she asked me to lie, to make it look like the issue was on your side." The words hit like a gut punch. For years, I'd carried the weight of that lie, thinking I was the problem. Now, to find out she'd manipulated me so thoroughly, it was almost too much to process. "That's not all, is it?" I asked, my voice hard. Collins hesitated, then nodded. "Her foundation, Natalie claimed it was for children's education overseas, but I've heard things. Whispers about irregularities. About children being placed with families through questionable means. Philip Grant is involved and it's not above board. That's all I know." It wasn't enough to satisfy me, but it was a start. That night, I sat alone in my study, staring at the Foundation's website on my laptop. Its mission statement talked about education, opportunity, and better futures, but the polished language rang hollow now. I couldn't look at it without imagining the lies it was built on. The more I read, the angrier I became. If what Collins had said was true, this wasn't just about Natalie lying to me. This was about exploiting vulnerable children and families, all under the guise of charity. I needed help. Someone who could dig into the financials and find out what was really going on. The next morning, I approached Elijah Brooks, a sharp young analyst at my firm. Elijah was fresh out of graduate school, but his knack for spotting patterns in complex data had already set him apart. "Elijah," I said as we sat down in a quiet corner of the office, "I need you to help me with something. Off the record." He raised an eyebrow. "Off the record? Sounds interesting already." I handed him a folder with what little information I had on the Foundation. "I need you to find any financial irregularities tied to this organization. Unusual transfers, discrepancies. Anything that doesn't add up." Elijah flipped through the documents, his expression growing more serious. "This could take some time, but I'll do it. Are you sure you're ready for what I might find?" I nodded. "I don't care what it is. I need the truth." While Elijah started his investigation, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Clara Grant Mitchell, Philip's sister. Clara was a child psychologist who had distanced herself from her brother after a falling out. If anyone knew the truth about Philip's involvement, it was her. Clara agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. She looked surprised to see me, but her expression softened when I explained why I'd reached out. "I've always had my doubts about that foundation," she admitted, stirring her coffee. "Philip's been evasive about his role in it, and some of the cases I've seen, they raise questions." "What kind of questions?" I pressed. She pulled out a notebook and flipped through pages of handwritten notes. "I've worked with several families who adopted through Natalie's network. Many of the children have gaps in their histories, no clear records of how they came to be in the system. And there are patterns of trauma that suggest they may have been taken from their biological families under dubious circumstances." Clara's voice grew quieter. "If what I suspect is true, this isn't just unethical. It's criminal." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. "Can you prove it?" "I've been documenting everything I can," she said, passing me copies of her notes. "It's not enough to blow the lid off the operation, But it's a start. Elijah's findings came in a few days later, and they were damning. There are multiple shell companies tied to the foundation, he explained as he laid out spreadsheets and flowcharts in my study. Funds are being funneled through offshore accounts, and there are payments to individuals whose identities are suspiciously hard to verify. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing, but they made one mistake. What's that? I asked, leaning over the table. They didn't account for someone like me, Elijah said with a small smirk. There's a clear pattern of laundering, and it all leads back to Philip Grant and Natalie Parker. I spent that night going over everything. Clara's documentation, Elijah's analysis, and the pieces I'd gathered myself. Together, it painted a horrifying picture of corruption, deceit, and exploitation. The foundation wasn't helping children, it was profiting from their suffering. And Natalie and Philip had used my name to give it credibility, all while lying to me about everything that mattered. I stared at the evidence spread across my desk, anger coursing through me. This wasn't just about Natalie anymore. It was about exposing the entire operation and making sure they couldn't hurt anyone else. As I sat in the quiet of the study, a single thought crystallized in my mind. It's time to take them down. The more I uncovered about Natalie's foundation, the darker the truth became. What had started as whispers about irregularities had grown into a chilling reality, one that left no room for doubt. This wasn't just about fraudulent adoptions. It was a sprawling network, using children not only for profit but as pawns to gain leverage over powerful people. Clara and I sat in her office late one evening, her desk covered in files and photographs. She had spent years quietly gathering evidence, but even she hadn't fully grasped the scope of the operation until now. These aren't just adoptions gone wrong, Clara said, sliding a folder across the desk. These are children being used as bargaining chips. Judges, politicians, even corporate executives. They're complicit, whether they realize it or not. I flipped through the folder, each page worse than the last. Families who thought they were helping vulnerable children were instead paying exorbitant fees to line the pockets of people like Natalie and Philip. Their donations, meant to support orphanages and educational programs, were funneled into offshore accounts, with only a fraction reaching its intended recipients. This isn't just corruption, I said, my voice heavy. It's exploitation on a scale I didn't think was possible. Clara nodded, her expression grim. And the longer it continues, the more lives it destroys. As if the betrayal wasn't already unbearable, another revelation came crashing down on me. Natalie was pregnant. First, I couldn't believe it. I thought of the years we'd spent trying to have a child, the treatments, the heartbreak, the blame I'd shouldered because of her lies. And now, after everything, she was carrying a child, but not mine. It was Philip's. I found out when I stumbled upon a sonogram image tucked into her desk drawer at home. Her name was on it, along with a due date that made the timeline clear. She hadn't even bothered to hide it. I confronted her that evening, my anger barely contained. "You're pregnant," I said, holding up the sonogram. Natalie's face froze, her usual poise faltering. "Daniel, I can explain." "Don't bother." I cut her off. "It's his, isn't it?" "Philip's." Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. "You've lied to me about everything," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "The treatments, the foundation, and now this. Was there ever a single moment of honesty between us?" She didn't respond, and I left the house without waiting for an answer. That night, I sat in my study, staring at the growing mountain of evidence. Elijah's investigations had uncovered the financial backbone of the network. Offshore accounts used to launder the profits from the trafficking operation. "These accounts are registered under shell companies," Elijah explained during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "They're layered to avoid detection, but I've traced enough of the transactions to link them back to the foundation and to Philip and Natalie." "Good," I said, leaning back in my chair. "That's exactly what we need." Clara's records showed how the children were moved through the system, their identities carefully obscured with falsified documents. Elijah's findings exposed the financial machinery that kept the operation running. Together, they formed a damning narrative, one that couldn't be ignored. Every revelation only strengthened my resolve. Natalie and the Bennetts had built their lives on lies, and I had unknowingly helped them. But not anymore. I spent weeks constructing a meticulous plan to expose the network. It wasn't just about taking down Natalie or even Philip. It was about dismantling the entire operation and ensuring that no one else suffered at their hands. With each new piece of evidence, the picture became clearer. The Bennetts weren't just corrupt, they were dangerous, and they were about to face the consequences of everything they'd done. As I stared at the files spread across my desk, I made a silent promise to myself. This ends with them. The first crack came with the media expose. It aired on a Thursday evening during prime time when the world was ready to watch. I sat in my living room, alone, as the news anchor began unraveling the truth about Natalie's foundation. Clara's voice, steady yet filled with quiet anguish, carried the weight of the revelations. "These aren't just irregularities," Clara explained, her face somber as the camera zoomed in. "This is a system of exploitation. Vulnerable families are being deceived, and children are being taken from stable homes under false pretenses. They're being trafficked into environments that prioritize profit over their well-being." Her words were punctuated by video clips of orphanages tied to the foundation. The footage was damning. Overcrowded facilities, desperate caregivers, and records showing payments funneled into accounts associated with Natalie, Philip, and their network. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction as the story unfolded. The public's reaction was immediate: outrage, disgust, and a demand for accountability. The Bennetts' perfect facade was crumbling, and this was only the beginning. As the expose aired, a second phase of the operation was already in motion. Coordinated raids on orphanages linked to the foundation were conducted in cities across the country. Law enforcement worked with child welfare organizations to rescue dozens of children, ensuring they were placed in safe, trauma-informed care. Clara was at the forefront, using her expertise to guide the process and advocate for the children's needs. "These kids have been through enough," Clara told the teams. "The goal now is to give them the stability and care they've been denied." Watching her work was inspiring. Clara's commitment to the children was unshakable, and it reminded me why we'd started this fight in the first place. Back in Boston, the Bennetts' world came crashing down. Margaret and Edward were arrested at their estate, their carefully curated reputation as philanthropists shattered. The images of them being led out in handcuffs made headlines within hours, a stark contrast to the glamorous couple who had once hosted extravagant galas. Natalie, meanwhile, was detained at a family guest house where she'd been staying since the foundation came under scrutiny. I wasn't there to see it happen, but I imagined her face when the agents arrived. How the realization must have hit her that her lies had finally caught up to her. The fallout spread like wildfire, ensnaring more than just the Bennetts. Judges, politicians, and corporate executives who had turned a blind eye, or actively participated in the scheme, faced mounting scrutiny. Elijah's meticulous financial analysis provided a roadmap for investigators, exposing bribes, kickbacks, and illegal transactions. "This isn't just a single operation," Elijah said during a debrief. "This is a web of corruption, and we've only scratched the surface." His findings didn't just expose the guilty. They sparked reforms in adoption oversight, closing the loopholes that had allowed Natalie and her network to operate unchecked for so long. For me, the hardest part wasn't dismantling the network. It was protecting the families who had unknowingly participated in the adoptions. Many of these families had acted in good faith, believing they were giving children a better future. Now they were caught in the aftermath, unsure if their adoptions would be invalidated or if they'd lose the children they had come to love. I spent weeks working behind the scenes, coordinating with lawyers and child welfare advocates to ensure these families weren't unfairly punished. Each case was reviewed individually, with a focus on the best interests of the children. "This isn't about blame," I told the team during one meeting. "It's about doing what's right." These families were deceived, just like everyone else. As the investigation expanded, the true scope of the Bennett scheme became clear. The network had ties to international operations, with forged documents masking the identities of children taken from their biological families. Some had been moved across borders, their stories erased to make them more appealing to wealthy adoptive parents. Clara worked tirelessly to ensure the rescued children received trauma-informed care. She partnered with psychologists, social workers, and educators to create support plans for each child. "They've been through hell," Clara said during one meeting. "But with the right care, they can heal. That has to be our focus." Through it all, I made sure the operation remained focused on justice, not revenge. It would have been easy to let my anger at Natalie, Philip, and the Bennetts cloud my judgment. But this wasn't about settling scores. It was about exposing the truth and protecting those who had been hurt by their lies. The exposé, the raids, the arrests, they were all steps toward accountability. And while the damage Natalie and her family had caused couldn't be undone, I took solace in knowing we had stopped them from hurting anyone else. As I left my office one evening, exhausted but resolute, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The betrayal I'd uncovered, the lies I'd endured, and the fight to expose the truth. It had all been worth it, because now the Bennetts' empire of deception was no more. And this was only the beginning of their reckoning. The Bennetts' downfall was swift and merciless. With their arrests and the media storm that followed, their once vaunted reputation crumbled under the weight of public outrage. Margaret Bennett, who had cultivated an image of elegance and generosity, found herself cast out by the very social circles she'd ruled over. High society friends who had once clinked champagne glasses in her grand estate now avoided her entirely, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. Edward Bennett fared no better. His legal career, once distinguished and respected, ended in disgrace. Stripped of his title and barred from practicing law, he was sentenced for corruption after evidence revealed his complicity in covering up the foundation's fraudulent activities. His name, once synonymous with power and influence, became a byword for betrayal. And then there was Natalie. Her charges included fraud, conspiracy, and an unexpected twist: her involvement in Philip's disappearance. It turned out that Philip Grant, her co-conspirator and former fiancé, had gone missing shortly before the investigation reached its peak. Evidence pointed to Natalie's role in orchestrating his escape, or perhaps something darker. The public outcry was deafening. People demanded accountability at every level, not just for the Bennetts but for the system that had allowed their operation to flourish unchecked. Elijah Brooks, whose meticulous work had unraveled the financial intricacies of the scheme, became an unexpected hero. His analysis of the Foundation's offshore accounts and shell companies not only dismantled the network but also exposed vulnerabilities in existing regulations. His findings became the basis for sweeping reforms in adoption oversight and financial transparency. "I just followed the data," Elijah said during a televised interview. "The real credit goes to the people who fought for justice, especially for the children who were hurt by this." Still, his work didn't go unnoticed. Regulatory agencies sought his expertise, and his rise as a leader in ethical compliance was meteoric. Clara Grant Mitchell took on the monumental task of transforming the Foundation into what it should have been all along. Under her leadership, the Foundation shifted its focus to family reunification and ethical child welfare practices. She worked tirelessly to identify children who had been taken from their biological families and began the painstaking process of reconnecting them. "This isn't just about undoing harm," Clara said during a press conference. "It's about building something better, something that puts the well-being of children and families above all else." Her dedication inspired others in the field, and the Foundation became a model for ethical child welfare programs worldwide. As for me, my work didn't end with the arrests or the dismantling of the network. There were still families who needed support, those who had unknowingly participated in the adoptions, now grappling with the fear of losing the children they had come to love. I worked behind the scenes to help rebuild trust and ensure that each case was handled with care and compassion. I also made it my mission to advocate for the children who had been caught in the Bennett's web. Many were too young to understand what had happened, but they deserved a future free from exploitation and uncertainty. One evening, as I walked through a community center where some of the rescued children were staying, I watched Clara lead a group therapy session. Her calm, nurturing presence brought a sense of safety to the room, and I felt a glimmer of hope. These children had been through unimaginable trauma, but now, They had people fighting for them. The Bennett's empire had been built on lies, but the work to repair the damage was built on truth. Margaret, Edward, and Natalie faced the consequences of their actions, but their downfall was only part of the story. The real victory was in the lives we were beginning to rebuild, the families reunited, the children given a chance to heal, and the trust restored where it had been shattered. Despite everything, I refused to let this operation become about revenge. Justice had been served, and now it was about ensuring this never happened again. As I left the community center that night, I felt a sense of closure. The Bennett story was coming to an end, but for those of us who had fought to expose the truth, a new chapter was just beginning. Months after the fall of the Bennetts, the dust had finally started to settle. The operation they had built on lies and exploitation was gone, dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but the consequences of their actions. What they had left behind, however, was a trail of broken families and children in need of care. For me, the fight hadn't ended with their arrests. It had simply shifted. My focus was no longer on exposing the truth but on rebuilding lives, starting with my own. Clara's work with the foundation was nothing short of remarkable. Under her leadership, the organization had transformed into a beacon of hope. Every child rescued from the Bennett's operation was given a chance to heal, whether through reunification with their biological families or placement in carefully vetted, loving homes. These kids deserve more than just a second chance, Clara said one day as we sat in her office, reviewing case files. They deserve stability, a future. Couldn't have agreed more. Watching her pour herself into her work, I saw the determination that had kept her going even when things seemed impossible. She wasn't just undoing harm. She was building something that would last. Elijah's impact was felt far beyond the confines of our initial investigation. The regulatory frameworks he had developed to prevent exploitation were being adopted by organizations worldwide. His work had become the gold standard for ethical compliance, ensuring that what happened with the Bennett's Foundation could never happen again. People think systems are too big to change, Elijah told me during one of our rare quiet moments. But all it takes is the right pressure in the right places. Change is always possible. He had proven that with every new policy, every reform that tightened loopholes and protected vulnerable families. For me, the most profound change came in the form of two small voices calling me Dad. Lucas and Isla Carter were siblings, rescued from the Bennett's operation. Lucas was 9, thoughtful and protective of his 6-year-old sister, Isla, whose bright smile could light up any room. When I first met them, they were hesitant, unsure of the world around them and the people in it. But over time, trust grew. My house, once quiet and sterile, became a home filled with laughter, stories, and the occasional sibling spat over toys. Lucas loved to help me cook, insisting he could crack eggs better than I could. Isla painted pictures that covered the fridge, each one brighter than the last. They had been through so much, but their resilience amazed me every day. One evening, as we sat on the living room floor building a Lego castle, Isla looked up at me and said, "I'm glad we're here." Her words brought tears to my eyes. "Me too," I said softly, pulling her and Lucas into a hug. In that moment, I realized just how much good had come from the darkness we had uncovered. Clara continued her work tirelessly, but she always made time to check in on Lucas and Isla. Her dedication to their well-being, and the well-being of every child affected by the operation, was unwavering. "These two are going to thrive with you," she told me one afternoon as she watched them play in the backyard. "You're giving them exactly what they need." "Maybe," I said, smiling as Isla chased Lucas with a water balloon. "But they've given me more than they'll ever know." The reforms Elijah spearheaded created ripples that would be felt for generations. Adoption agencies, child welfare organizations, and even governments adopted his policies, building systems that prioritized ethics and transparency. He remained humble through it all, insisting that the work wasn't about recognition. "This isn't my legacy," he said once. "It's theirs. The kids who finally have a chance because the system didn't fail them." In the end, rebuilding from the ashes of the Bennett's operation wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about creating something stronger, something better than what had come before. Lucas and Isla reminded me every day why this work mattered. Their laughter echoed through the halls of my home, a constant testament to the power of hope and resilience. The Bennett's lies had caused so much harm, but from that darkness, light had emerged. And for the first time in a long time I felt at peace. 5 years had passed since the Bennett's empire crumbled, and yet their shadow lingered in the world they once ruled. Their legacy was one of disgrace. Margaret Bennett, once the queen of Boston's high society, now lived in isolation, shunned by the very people who had once admired her. Edward, once a powerful legal mind, was reduced to a cautionary tale, his name forever associated with corruption. Natalie's imprisonment had been a turning point in public perception, not just of the Bennetts, but of how easily influence could shield wrongdoing. For me, their downfall was less about their personal suffering and more about what it had achieved. Their lies had sparked something bigger than themselves: reform, accountability, and change. Elijah Brooks' oversight protocols had become the gold standard in child welfare and adoption practices worldwide. Governments, agencies, and nonprofits adopted his frameworks, ensuring that transparency and ethics were no longer afterthoughts but priorities. His work had reshaped an industry that had once been rife with exploitation, and it was hard to believe this movement had started with his quiet, late-night investigations in my study. "Sometimes I think about how close we came to missing it," Elijah had said during a recent meeting. "One more layer of deception, one more loophole, and we might not have caught them. But we did," I reminded him. "And now, no one else can do what they did." His smile was brief but genuine. "That's the point, isn't it?" Clara's foundation had grown into a force for good that far exceeded even her initial vision. Families separated by the Bennett's operation had been reunited wherever possible, and for those who couldn't return to their biological families, the foundation ensured they were placed in loving, carefully vetted homes. "We're not just fixing what was broken," Clara had said during the foundation's 5th anniversary gala. "We're creating a future where no family has to fear being torn apart by greed or corruption." The room had erupted in applause, but Clara's focus had been on the children in attendance. Young lives that were now thriving because of her work. And then there was my family. Lucas and Isla had transformed my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. Their resilience was a constant source of inspiration, and watching them grow was the greatest joy I'd ever known. Lucas, now 14, had become a voracious reader, often burying himself in books about science and history. Isla, at 11, was an artist through and through, her drawings covering every available surface in our home. One evening, as I watched Lucas explain a science experiment to Isla at the kitchen table, I felt a wave of gratitude. Despite everything they'd been through, they were happy, thriving, and filled with a curiosity that reminded me of how much good could come from even the darkest times. "You're staring again," Lucas teased, catching my gaze. "Can't help it," I replied, grinning. "You two are pretty amazing."
Isla beamed.
"We know." My work with Elijah and Clara continued, though the nature of it had shifted. Instead of fighting to expose corruption, we were focused on maintaining the systems we had rebuilt, ensuring that the protections we'd put in place remained strong and that no one could exploit them the way the Bennetts had. "It's not glamorous," Clara had said during one of our regular check-ins, "but it's the most important work we can do." And she was right. The real legacy of our efforts wasn't in the headlines or the accolades. It was in the children who now had futures they could look forward to, in the families who had found healing, and in the systems that now protected the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. One night, as I joined Lucas and Isla in the living room for a movie, I found myself reflecting on how far we had come. The Bennett story was no longer a weight on my shoulders. It was a chapter that had closed, replaced by the work we had done to ensure their evil couldn't return. My victory wasn't in their disgrace. It was in the lives we had rebuilt, the protections we had created, and the hope we had given to so many. As Lucas passed me a bowl of popcorn and Isla curled up next to me with a sketchpad in hand, I realized something profound. The real triumph wasn't in dismantling what was broken. It was in building something better. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter and love, I knew we had done just that.